Normally, these kinds of visits are reserved for either the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister. But Braverman has said that really the purpose of her visit is to try to reinforce the UK's commitment for the Rwanda plan. So, as you mentioned during your very comprehensive introduction, she'll be meeting the President of Rwanda and also visiting some of the sites that will be used supposedly to host some of the migrants. However, I think if you dig a little bit deeper into the kind of details of the nature of the visit, that really kind of reveals the ultimate purpose of what this visit is really for. And I think ultimately, to my mind, this is sort of a political stunt paid for ultimately by the taxpayers to try to extract as much kind of political capital as much as possible for a domestic audience. And I think the real evidence for that is the fact that only government-friendly news sources were actually invited to accompany Braverman as part of the news delegation. The BBC and The Guardian, which tend to be much more critical of the government's sort of migrant strategy, were not invited at all. I think, given the fact that, Britain, of course, is an open, transparent democracy, I think this is a very surprising element to it. And I think really that kind of demonstrates actually a much wider part of the problem with the whole government's migration strategy, which, again, to my mind, is more of a kind of publicity PR campaign than actually a policy in its own right. Because I think ultimately, the government knows that it's actually very unlikely that the Rwanda strategy and the illegal migration bill that was unveiled a few weeks ago is actually going to be implemented in full. And I think, as you mentioned, the courts are currently dealing with the issue of the Rwanda plan, and we're likely to see more of that for the rest of the year. I think there are major impracticalities to the plan, just due to the fact that, we had 45,000 people crossing the channel into the UK last year, and it's ultimately just not going to be practical to try to transfer people in the tens of thousands to Rwanda. And I think there are also sort of just questions over actually, how the kind of inconsistencies within the plan. For example, Braverman has insisted that Rwanda remains a safe country, and that it's a great place for migrants to start a new life. But at the same time, the government is saying that actually the Rwanda plan will serve as a deterrent for more migrants to come to the UK. So ultimately, there's an inconsistency, because if ultimately, there's no threat to migrants if they're going to a place which is going to be great for them. So ultimately, I think, to my mind and many others in the UK, this is just sort of part of a general strategy by the government to try to distract from many of the domestic, particularly economic woes that we're facing here in the UK. But ultimately, I don't think it's one that will provide enough political capital for the Conservatives to turn around, the next election result, which will likely produce a different government.
Right. Now, Adam, as you've touched on, from the perspective of these asylum seekers, they are anyway moving from conflict-ridden countries. How would they see this move to Rwanda? It seems somewhat ironic.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's very difficult to say overall, what migrants and refugees, how they would look at this, because, of course, each case is different depending on the individual, depending on, whatever nature of conflict or persecution they are fleeing from. But I think, ultimately, it all comes down to perception of Britain. And I think this actually goes beyond the view of the asylum seeker or the migrant. But actually, Britain was for quite a long time viewed as being quite an open and a tolerant society that really valued what migration and asylum seekers can bring to the UK, both economically and culturally. And I think the fact that, Britain, through the lens of this current Conservative government, seems to be really doing everything it possibly can to try to change that perception of Britain as no longer being a welcoming country, I think really, is quite a drastic turn in how Britain used to be seen. But I ultimately don't think that this will be, successful in trying to deter people from coming to the UK. I think ultimately, people are in such desperate situations around the world due to conflict, due to climate change, that actually they're in situations where they can't afford to, not come to countries which they perceive to be potentially safe for them. Obviously, no migrants or refugees or asylum seekers have actually been sent to Rwanda yet, so we don't really know what their experiences would be. However, we do know that only 21 people were actually returned to their countries of origin. So that represents about 0.1% of the overall number of people that came to the UK on small boats last year. So, clearly the kind of the story that the government is trying to project, that actually people will be returned to where they came from, is not really going to be practical on a legal and also a practical level.